I get, the more I wish I could just sit down and enjoy the speakers. After all these years, I think I've done my bit. Last time I was here was 1997. So that was, 21 years ago. I don't know if my hair was black at that time or what, but I certainly did have more to cover this scalp. An honor to be here. We were in Egypt and Jordan over the last 2 weeks. Just landed a couple of days ago after finishing meetings in Amman and in Cairo. It was a fascinating time to be in the Middle East in the light of all that is really going on out there. So landed a couple of days ago, gave my wife a hug and said hello to the family, packed the bags and arrived here. And just for the record, I'm very grateful for all the accolades that were given to me, but I've been to 70, not 700 countries. I'm sure you figured that out. It is important for us to keep this sure, because I can guarantee you tomorrow morning we'll get a call in the office, somebody saying, is Ravi telling everybody he's been to 700 countries? I've had people write and ask me if Ravi Zacharias is really my name, or did I make it up? When I retire someday, I'm going to read all the mail that we get, all the accolades and all the brickbats and everything hurled, and it'll balance out at the end. Some years ago, I was traveling on a flight, and I was just putting my bags down, about to sit down, and a man across on the other aisle called me by my name and waved one of my books at me, said he was planning to read it on the plane. I felt pretty good about it. About 30 minutes later, I got up to go to the restroom, and I looked in his direction, and he was sound asleep with the book sitting across his chest. So I consoled myself by the fact that at least it was a cure for insomnia. But there's nothing like raising you up and then flattening you immediately after. What an honor to be here, especially in the alma mater of my good friend Tim Tebow, who has left his tracks out here. Maybe I'll end now and tell my wife it ended up with an ovation and I can leave. But Tim Tebow is a good friend of mine indeed, and we do stay in touch. And I thought I'd mention the connection in case, looking at me, you could see the same build that he and I had. A friend of mine used to tell me at college that my muscles are like gold, hard to find. Now that was just a joke, but my wife was serious one day. My wife's from Canada. They have a very subtle sense of humor in Canada. So I was giving her a nice big hug, and after I gave her a hug, she felt my arms and she said, I want to tell you something. You really have the arms of a thinking man. Talk about a body slam, you know. And I looked at her and told her I'd do my best to develop the body of a non-thinking man. And she discouraged me for that too. All jokes aside, humor aside, thank you for coming out tonight on this weeknight. Nice to see a nearly full house. And to my friend Bob Shetler, thank you, sir, for all your hard work. And to President Fox and your leadership team, with all the things you have to do today, the fact that you are here and taking in this session is a real honor and a distinct privilege for me. Even though I've done this now for nearly half a century, it's always a nerve-wracking experience. You never feel any more at ease. You're always all tensed up because one wrong word and you could be in trouble. So I am honored and thankful that you would pay us the respect of coming to give us a hearing, especially taking ideas from our book, Jesus Among Secular Gods. It was years ago, as I was reading Malcolm Muggeridge, I remember this comment that he made. He said, it is difficult to resist the conclusion that 20th century man has decided to abolish himself. Tired of the struggle to be himself, he has created boredom out of his own affluence, impotence out of his own erotomania, and vulnerability out of his own strength. He himself blows the trumpet that brings the walls of his own cities crashing down, until at last, having educated himself into imbecility, having drugged and polluted himself into stupefaction, he keels over a weary, battered old brontosaurus and becomes extinct. fascinating insight from a man who observed culture, who himself had been through Russia and many other countries as a journalist and began to see where history was really going. It was Aldous Huxley who said, "We are living today not in the delicious intoxication of the early successes of science, rather in the grisly morning after, to see that what science may have actually done is to introduce us to improved means in order to obtain hitherto unimproved or rather deteriorated ends. What all this knowledge may have actually done is to introduce us to improved means to obtain deteriorated ends." My education and life has not been anywhere near as formal as I would like it to have been. I wish I had been to more institutions and studied under some of the finest minds, but most of my education has come from sitting across a dining table and listening to people within the framework of their own culture, talking about the struggles and the vicissitudes of history that they have had to encounter, and the pain and the agony through which many of these civilizations have emerged. When you go to a nation like Lebanon today, where 1/3 of its people in this country, once upon a time called the Pearl of the Middle East, when you sit down after a meal, what you're listening to is questions like this: what do we do with over 1 million refugees from Syria? You go into Jordan and you see hundreds of thousands of refugees from Iraq, hundreds of thousands of them from Syria, and one man who's working with these folks, trying to find home and succor and sustenance and food, sitting around a table there that afternoon, said to us, "We are suffering from what I call compassion fatigue. We no longer are able to dig deep enough to have the proper response to the misery with which we are living." Why present all of this at the beginning of a talk? It is because, ladies and gentlemen, we had dreamed somehow from the Romantic poets that man was being born again, that the 20th century would usher in some kind of a utopia, that all of the ambassadors in the United Nations would get together, and the more capacity we had to communicate, the greater the prospect of peace there would be. Instead, even in the last 24 hours, scientists have moved the clock one more point closer to a doomsday scenario. Whether it ever happens or not, who knows? But the fact is that the handwriting is on the wall, and our capacities are nowhere near in proportion to the character that will be demanded if we are to make this world a better place. We are living in extraordinary times. And one of the main reasons I keep going, even in the 7th decade of my life, where I could comfortably say, you know, after 5 decades of travel, time to spend time with the family, time to be at home, time to give the body some opportunity to recuperate. But I'm a man living with a passion and a conviction that the answers of Jesus are more needed now than ever before in the 5 decades of my traveling back and forth presenting answers to people. Just today I heard from a man in Egypt and one from Jordan. "Ravi, we miss you here. Please come back. I'm just one, you are many." And the Lord raises up more and more with the positive answers that we can give. What are the questions? How do we deal with the struggles such as now? And I'm so grateful to be teaming up with my colleague Vince. He's been such an inspiration to me, much more qualified than I am really to be addressing these issues. And as I team up with these younger minds, my hope grows steadily. And as I see you here, you wouldn't be here, most of you at least would not be here, if you didn't have at least an iota of interest in listening to what the answers are amongst the secular gods that now dominate the landscape. We are looking for at least one thing: coherence. Within and without, something that will put our lives together on the inside so that we don't live with this dissonance and disconnect within our own thinking. And hopefully in the diversity of people and cultures and ethnicities, we can learn to live peaceably with each other. Starting in the 1970s, Daniel Yankelevich, the social theorist, said this: culture is an effort to provide a coherent set of answers to the existential situations that confront all human beings in the passage of their lives. Culture is an effort to provide a coherent set of answers to the existential situations that confront all human beings in the passage of their lives. But a genuine cultural revolution then is one that makes a decisive break with the shared meanings of the past, particularly those which relate to the deepest questions of the purpose and nature of human life. We are looking for shared meanings of the past. But a cultural revolution takes place when we break away from those shared meanings and somehow try to find some common ground, looking for coherence in the existential questions. But as we look at this horizontally, what has happened vertically has dramatic ramifications. Somebody wrote this: first, dentistry was painless, then bicycles were chainless, and carriages were horseless, and many laws enforceless. Next, cookery was fireless, telegraphy was wireless, cigars were nicotineless, and coffee caffeineless. Soon oranges were seedless, the putting green was weedless, the college boy was hatless, the proper diet fatless. New motor roads are dustless, the latest steel is rustless, our tennis courts are swordless, our new religion godless. So trying to find answers on this horizontal axis while losing connection with any transcendent perspective has become the biggest challenge of our times. Now here it is, in the West we are really wondering if this person we call God really has any answers for us. You go to the Middle East today and there's the highest rate of turning away from the faith of their fathers and the largest number of atheistic-minded young people today in that part of the world, because they say religion has actually stolen from them their future and created havoc in the midst of those settings. It's fascinating to see two things. Number one, are we going to find any answers? And number two, religion alone is not going to give us the answer, especially if it is enforced and politicized. We cannot find answers in that kind of enforcement. What happened? I think three moods took place beginning from the 70s. I will go through them very quickly, and after that, Vince will join me on the platform and Joe will moderate as we take your questions. The three moods that took place, I deal with some of this in the book, is the mood of secularization, pluralization, and privatization. Each one of these are noble in their intent, but the side effects have been rather drastic and in many ways unwelcome. What is secularization? We have sociologists who have wonderfully described and defined these for us. One of the most famous of them, writing in the 70s, defined secularization as the process by which religious ideas, institutions, and interpretations had lost their social significance. A process by which religious ideas, institutions, and interpretations have lost their social significance. In other words, it meant to bring religious ideas, institutions, and interpretations into the social fabric is no longer considered a legitimate option for us. We feel it is bringing to bear some kind of a dictatorial idea or ideology into a secularized society. Now, let me say this right from the beginning. I believe the process of secularization and secularism is the logical need for any government by which to manage a diversity of cultures. You institutionalize religion or you politicize religion, and both politics and religion lose their way. That's certainly half of the truth. But having said that, there's an implicit danger in that blanket statement. If you look at what religion did to politics in Germany, in France, in Russia, in the Middle East, and yes, even in my homeland of India, you see it has created more tensions and more distinctions between the people, those who do not want to abide by the mainline thinking of whatever is proposed. But if you take ethics away, you take a supervening moral reasoning away, what answers do we find then in having explanatory power for what is right, what is wrong, what is good, and what is bad? Let me explain this to you in very drastic terms. A few weeks ago, we were in Iraq. We were mainly in Kurdistan, but also went into Mosul. The devastation that has been created at the hands of ISIS are beyond description. Houses shattered, thousands murdered, subdivisions looking vacant, glass littering every home, and lives completely broken. As we were driving, we couldn't do that today. Some of them have made their way back. But I remember as on the last day, we were taken for lunch by a young Iraqi man, very solidly built. He took 3 of us out for lunch, and we were enjoying those shawarma sandwiches across there, that table, and he told us his story. He said, here's my story. He said, I was a killer. I was a brutal killer. One of my brothers was murdered by the enemy ranks, and I had decided I was going to level the score one at a time. And so I was taking the lives of people, and I went into one room with a gun, shot a man dead in cold blood, put a bullet into his head as he was lying in his bed there to avenge the killing of my brother. Unknown to me, his 4-year-old son was lying next to him. And the son is shaken awake at the sound of this gunfire and blood spilling out all over him from his father's head. And this little boy sits up and looks at this man, the killer, and says to him, where's my dad? What's happened to my father? And he said, I just looked at him and he was holding my hand. What's happened to my father? I pushed that hand away and looked down at him and said, your dad's in paradise. He's in heaven. And walked away. And he said, I left that room and sat amidst the pile of garbage cans, sobbing my heart out, crying uncontrollably and thinking to myself, what am I doing with my life? What am I doing to humanity? It's a tragic story, but let me ask you this. What would be possibly worse than that feeling? To go out and have another meal somewhere and celebrate another killing and not have any twinge of guilt or regret or remorse. So here's my question to you. What is the ontic referent? What is the objective reality that we can point to that legitimizes the sacredness of life? Every life. What is that same reality that ought to work within your conscience and mine when we have done something so wrong that we are willing to sit in a garbage heap and weep and say, what am I doing to myself? What am I doing to humanity? You see, guilt is a legitimate thrust of the conscience when something is awry, when something is broken, when something is not right. What has secularization got to give to us as an ontic referent by which all of humanity can be bound? I can think of only one way and two ideas. When Jesus was asked to give the greatest commandment, he could have stopped at one. Moses gave 613. David reduced it to 15. Isaiah reduced it to 11. Micah reduced it to 3, to do justice and love mercy and walk humbly before your God. That was good. Jesus didn't reduce it to 1. He could have. Could have very easily stopped out of the first and said to love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your mind and all your soul and all your strength. But he went on to say, and to love your neighbor as yourself. On these 2 commandments hang all of the laws and all of the prophets. Do you realize on those 2 commandments, 613 laws were hanging? that the vertical and the horizontal are inextricably bound. I have no right to violate your life. I have no right to draw your blood. Jesus paid you the greatest compliment when he said you were created in God's image, and that means a moral reasoning capacity and the right to self-determination. No other worldview will give you this. And so secularization leads you to a point of not finding that ontic referent for why you are intrinsically valuable, or finding the imperative why I am commanded to love you, even if I disagree with you. You know, so many things happen in our lives about which I'm not allowed to say anything, because we meet under circumstances that are very precarious sometimes, very precarious. But my mind goes back to just one conversation in one country, and I'll keep it minimal. We were sitting across the table from a man whose ideology has wreaked havoc in this world. And two of my colleagues are sitting next to me talking. And his biggest challenge was this: he could not differentiate between a person and his or her belief. They were so interwoven, he said, that violence was the logical outcome. If you disagree with a person's idea, you are free to do away with them. A 2-hour discussion on just that Jesus comes into the world to lead us from error into truth, but to always love the person, never to devalue the person. And the man sitting across discussing with us had no way to differentiate between the two. The way to solve this world's problems is get rid of the people who hold the ideas you don't like. Fascinating to see how impassioned he was about his belief. And the answers that we were trying to give. Secularization is a great idea as a general rule over against the diktat of religion. But I'll tell you what, if secularization does not find the transcendent ethic and the value of every human life, it will lead to ultimate slaughter and a society that does not have any remorse or any guilt or any shame. You show me a human being who never has any remorse, I will show you a monster. Secularization takes away the grounds for moral reasoning in absolutes, and certainly grounds to treat your fellow human being of intrinsic worth. So we moved to the next mood that came around, and that was pluralization. Pluralization is where the sociologists tell us is a competing number of worldviews that are available to its members, and no worldview is ultimately dominant. A competing number of worldviews available to its members, and no worldview is ultimately dominant. What happens when that takes place? You may come from a different culture to me. My wife, as I told you, is Canadian, and I'm Indian. And you know, in India, we refer to ourselves as Dharti ke Aadmi, people of the soil. And there is a song that was very popular in India. It said, Mera juta hai Japani, patloon Englishstani, sar par lal topi Rusi, phir bhi dil hai Hindustani. So my shoes may be Japanese, my trouser English, my hat may be Russian, but my heart is still Indian. You can't take that out of you. You can take the person out of the country. You can't take that ethnic reality out of their soul and out of their heart. And so we see values that come from completely different backgrounds. We think only of the problem of racism. The problem of racism is symptomatic of value differences that come within the heart, even of cultural and ethnic differences. But we go back to the same question. If secularization takes away from you the ontic referent for guilt and shame and moral reasoning, pluralization has a problem where we really don't have the ability to arrive at how to get along with each other. Peter Berger did seminal work in this field, and I had the privilege of interviewing him one day on a radio program. But here it is. I want to anchor this and move to my final thoughts so that we give you some time for questions. G.K. Chesterton, talking about rebellion in society, that which wants to throw away any shared meaning of the past, that which does not want to have any shared values, but you're rebelling and overthrowing. He wrote a powerful 2 paragraphs that summed it up. He said this: "The new rebel is a skeptic and will not entirely trust anything. He has no loyalty, therefore he can never be a true revolutionist. And the fact that he doubts everything gets in his way when he wants to denounce anything. For all denunciation implies a moral doctrine of some kind. And the modern skeptic doubts not only the institution he denounces, but the doctrine by which he denounces it. So he writes one book complaining that imperial oppression insults the purity of women. Then he writes another book, a novel, in which he insults it himself. As a politician, he will cry out that war is a waste of life. Then as a philosopher, that life itself is a waste of time. A Russian pessimist will denounce a policeman for killing a peasant, then prove by the highest philosophical principles that the peasant ought to have killed himself. A man denounces marriage as a lie, then denounces aristocratic profligates for treating it as a lie. The man of this school goes first to a political meeting where he complains that savages are treated as if they were beasts. Then he takes his hat and umbrella and goes on to a scientific meeting where he proves that they practically are beasts. In short, the modern revolutionist, being an infinite skeptic, is forever engaged in undermining his own minds. In his book on politics, he attacks men for trampling on morality. In his book on ethics, he attacks morality for trampling on men. Therefore, the modern man in revolt becomes practically useless for all purposes of revolt. By rebelling against everything, he has lost his right to rebel against anything. The confusion that comes. And that's what's really happened in Hollywood today, hasn't it? They have a right to complain of the exploitation of people for the sake of progress in society, but often the entertainment world itself exploits people and comes into your life and mine through the back door of the imagination rather than the front door of reason. A pluralized culture is a privileged culture, but a pluralized culture that lives in tension within itself without finding the answers again for moral reasoning is truly a very dangerous culture. And so we end up living with systemic and systematic contradiction. Notice these moods, as Peter Berker would say, are good things: secularization, pluralization. But secularization can lead to no shame when there's no transcendent ethic. Pluralization moves into tension points where we try to learn how to even get along with each other, and we find out it is nowhere near as easy. It is not so much a question of race as it is a question of values. The values that we hold shape what you and I are. Values come out of convictions. Foods and colors come out of opinions. You can change your opinion with time, but you cannot change your conviction without changing who you are. And so pluralization has a wonderful privilege of living together with other people. But what is the worldview that is going to be dominant if we in the West are to survive? I remember when I arrived in Canada, I was 20 years old, and it was 1966, and I was living in Toronto, Canada at that time, and watching culture on a change. I was a new follower of Jesus Christ, from having tried to take my own life at 17 to the new meaning and purpose he gave. I was working in the hotel industry. That's what I was preparing for in a career in the future, the hospitality world. And I would leave the hotel at about 2 in the morning, and I would see things happening there night after night, late hours, and I'd say to myself, I hope I never take on the habits that I'm watching take place. I hope I never lead such a reckless life in what I see happening. And it was a shock to my system to find out how many customers sitting by the bar room at 11 or 11:30 at night would start talking about how lonely and desperate their living really was. How desperate they were in trying to find hope and meaning. See, secularization breaks down shame. Pluralization breaks down reason. It leads me to my final thought. So what are we told in the West? Privatization. As Peter Berker reminds us again, that your religious life, your religious convictions, your spiritual convictions should be kept in private and never brought into the public sphere. And that's exactly where life breaks down and life becomes empty and meaningless when your values are to be told you must keep them in private, but don't bring them into the public arena. We are living this fragmented, disjointed existence. And so I want to close with one particular thing here and tell you what is the greatest struggle that we really have. The greatest struggle we have in life, if I understand you as a typical university student, and that I have, is in the search for meaning. Where are we going to find meaning in life? We have to start off by giving a definition. Who are we? Viktor Frankl says this in one of his books: if we present man with a concept of man which is not true, we may well corrupt him when we present him as an automaton of reflexes, as a mind machine, as a bundle of instincts, as a pawn of drives and reactions, as a mere product of heredity and environment. We feed the nihilism to which modern man is prone. I became acquainted with the last stage of corruption in my second concentration camp of Auschwitz. The gas chambers of Auschwitz were the ultimate consequence of the theory that man is nothing but the product of heredity and environment, or as the Nazi liked to say, of blood and soil. I'm absolutely convinced that the gas chambers of Auschwitz, Treblinka, and Majdanek are ultimately prepared not in some Ministry of Defense in Berlin, but rather at the desks and in the lecture halls of nihilistic scientists and philosophers. It was not prepared in the Defense Ministry, what happened in the Holocaust. It came from the desks of faculty and professors of nihilistic scientists and philosophers. Powerful statement. And so as I so respectfully look at your faculty, bumped into one of them on a flight last night while I was flying in, came and greeted me and welcomed me and said, "So glad you're coming to our campus." Faculty members have a huge responsibility in our time, training young minds like yours to tell you who you really are, because of the desks and philosophies can be given to young minds that show them they have value and intrinsic worth. Think of what is really going to be the difference that will make. Let me give you one illustration, give you a last quote and illustration, I'll be done. In 92, I was, I think it was 92, three visits, but one of them was in what is the former Soviet Union now. What was the former Soviet Union, and now and all to the balkanized state that we have. A general by the name of Kirshen invited me to speak there. After all these years, I made connection with him in the last month, and he sent me a beautiful letter inviting me to come back and visit. While I was speaking at the military academy there that he invited me to speak at, they were all atheists as professors, all of them, and their questions were pointed, poignant, harsh, tough. My wife on one side, my colleague on the other side. One of the things I shared with them shook them. And the professor and the general and I talked about it again as I went over the story with him. It's so long ago, I forget the sequence in which it happened, but the story that brought him to tears was this. They were trying to defend all of their ideology and all of their philosophy, and I was talking about how atheism ultimately will kill values in a nation. And I told them of Joseph Stalin, how he viewed people. A foreign dignitary had come to visit him and looked at him and said, "How long do you plan to keep torturing your people and think they will follow you?" Stalin never answered the question. He called the waiter and asked him to bring a live chicken to him. Stalin took that chicken, clutched that chicken, and started to defeather that bird. While it was struggling to break free from him, he was denuding it. And finally, completely denuded, while this dignitary was looking on, he took that denuded bird and put it down on the floor, took a piece of bread and walked away. And the chicken hobbled over towards him and nuzzled between his trouser legs. And he bent down with a piece of bread, and the chicken pecked away at it. He said, "Madam, do you have your answer?" He said, "I tortured this chicken. It will follow me for food the rest of its life. People are like that chicken. You torture them, they will follow you for food the rest of their lives." He obliterated 15 million of them. I kid you not, the general's lips began to quiver. And I said to him, "General, Your greatest need is the same as my greatest need. I need a heart that needs to be changed so that I will love God and love my fellow human being. You have the need for Jesus Christ to change your heart. He's the only one who's big enough to change it. I had the privilege of praying with that general. And as he writes back, he doesn't speak English. We are always using an interpreter. Through one of my interpreters, he wrote back. He said, I have a small apartment. I've never forgotten you. Please come and visit me again. I'd love to have you here. I can't have you stay with me. My apartment is so small, but I have never forgotten you. Let me close. The man who killed the man lying next to his son lives in Iraq today. And after he took us out for lunch, my colleague was with me as we had that lunch, and he told the story. He said, I sat in that garbage heap, sobbing my heart out, so upset. And I tried to sleep, but every time I fell asleep, I had a dream. And in that dream, I was seeing Jesus, and I was even angrier than before, inviting me to come to him. This is his story. This is his story. 3 times in that same garbage heap, he says, Jesus comes to me in a dream. He said, I was angry first, gave my life to Jesus Christ. Now he works at a hospital in Iraq, binding the wounds of the broken and helping people get better and get well. The heart has been so dramatically changed for this man. Moving from an ordinary killer to a philosopher like Anthony Flew. When I was studying in the 80s, Flew was the big atheist. You had to read everything Anthony Flew wrote. And as he comes to the tail end of his life, he starts a search for God again. And what does he say? 2 things. 2 things. The moral reasoning we need was not explainable in his naturalistic framework, number 1. Number 2, he said, if Jesus really rose again from the dead, if I could be convinced of that, that would be the point of reference to transform my own thinking. And he referred to N.T. Wright's book in the Resurrection. He said, C.S. Lewis, with his moral argument, and N.T. Wright writing on the resurrection are the 2 arguments I'm so struggling with and trying desperately to come to terms with. Ladies and gentlemen, that is your struggle and mine too. How do we separate good from evil? How do we know whether we live beyond these 70 years and 10? Those 2 are the hinges. May I close with a poem written by Francis Thompson, who was a drug addict and ran most of his life from God. And he was at Charing Cross buying his drugs, and by the River Thames, where he would lie by the river at night. He'd run away from home. He'd wrap his dirty raincoat by the River Thames and sleep at night. In the day, he would go and sell shoelaces and pencils till he could make some money to buy his drugs. He began to read the Bible and was reading about Jacob. And then he wrote this, O world invisible, we view thee. O world intangible, we touch thee. O world unknowable, we know thee. Inapprehensible, we clutch thee. Does a fish soar to find the ocean, an eagle plunge to find the air? Do we ask of the stars in motion if they have rumor of thee there? Not whether wheeling systems darken or our benumbed conceiving soars, the drift of pinions would we hearken, beats on our own clay-shuttered doors. The angels keep their ancient places, touch but a stone and start a wing. 'Tis ye, 'tis your estranged faces that amiss the many splendored thing. But when so sad thou canst not sadder, crying upon thy so sore loss, shall shine the traffic of Jacob's ladder, pitched between heaven and Charing Cross. Yea, in the night, my soul, my daughter, cry clutching heaven by the hems, lo, Christ walking on the water, not of Gennesaret, but Thames. He walks in Charing Cross, and he walks by the River Thames. He's here in this auditorium at the University of Florida tonight. May you hear his voice and him calling to you, saying, this is the way, walk ye in it. God bless you. Thank you.